Hello and welcome to Talking Tudors, a fortnightly podcast about the ever-fascinating Tudor dynasty. My name is Natalie Grueninger and I'll be your host and guide on this journey through 16th century England. Are you ready to step through the veil of time into the dazzling and dangerous world of the Tudor court? Without further ado, it's time to talk Tudors. Hello everyone, welcome to Talking Tudors, episode 168, and the first instalment of all things 16th century women. I'm your host, Natalie Grueninger. Thank you so much for joining me. Over the next 2 months, we'll be exploring the lives of 16th century women through a series of podcast episodes and video lectures, which will be published on my YouTube channel, so be sure to subscribe. While all the content is free, I ask that you consider supporting the event by becoming a Talking Tudors patron. Visit patreon.com/talkingtudors for more information. Join the Talking Tudors patron family, and in addition to receiving lots of Tudor-themed goodies, you'll have access to patron-only monthly competitions. All patrons are eligible to attend monthly Talking Tudors live talks, which take place on Zoom. These events are exclusive to patrons. On the weekend of the 20th and the 21st of August, I'll be chatting to Adrian Dillard about Jane Seymour and Marjorie Horseman. Details will be published on Patreon. You can also support the podcast and share your love of Tudor history with the world by buying Talking Tudors merchandise. There are a number of designs and products available, including phone cases, mugs, notebooks, and apparel. Check out all the products at talkingtudors.threadless.com. I would love to see pics of you wearing or using your Talking Tudors merch, so please do tag me on social media and use the hashtag #ILoveTalkingTudors. Now, on to today's episode. I'm thrilled that joining me on the show is Kate McCaffrey. Kate is an historian and assistant curator at Anne Boleyn's childhood home of Hever Castle in Kent. She recently graduated from her master's degree in medieval and early modern studies from the University of Kent, where her thesis focused on the groundbreaking new evidence she uncovered in one of Anne Boleyn's printed books of hours held at Hever Castle. She has just co-curated the Becoming Anne Connections Culture Court exhibition running this year at Hever and co-authored the accompanying book entitled Becoming Anne alongside Dr. Owen Emerson. Our conversation's coming up straight after this short musical break, courtesy of guitarist Jon Sayles. Welcome to All Things 16th Century Women. Kate, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me on. It's an honor to be here.
Yes, it's so exciting. You're kicking off this special online festival of learning, and I'm just so excited to have you here. So, how about we start with an introduction? Would you mind just introducing yourself to our listeners and just telling us a little bit about you and your background?
Yes, absolutely. So my name is Kate McCaffrey, and I'm an historian and an assistant curator at Hever Castle in Kent, which is where I co-curated our current exhibition entitled "Becoming Anne: Connections, Culture, Court," and that's all about Anne Boleyn's younger life and her upbringing. And I work closely with Anne's private books of hours at Hever. That's where my research is kind of centered, and my research with them so far has brought to light some groundbreaking new evidence about Anne's memory and her legacy and her personal and largely female networks, both during her lifetime and after her execution.
Yes, it's so exciting. And if anyone wants to listen, I have chatted to Kate about her incredible research. So you can go and have a listen to that episode after this one. Don't go anywhere just yet. We titled this talk Rival Queens, an Outdated Narrative. And I know both you and I are quite passionate about this. So what do you think, Kate, are some of those outdated and problematic narratives and portrayals that circulate today about the Tudor queens?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I'm absolutely passionate about this topic, as you are. I've always been drawn in my studies to these kind of stories and tales of powerful historical women, and the 16th century is absolutely jam-packed full of them. And I think there's so many outdated and problematic narratives and portrayals that kind of circulate today about Tudor queens. I don't think these outdated interpretations are exclusive to Tudor queens either. I think they extend, to women throughout history, whether they were royal or not. And they're all underpinned by a kind of systemic issue, I think, but we'll talk a bit later on about why the narratives exist. But one clear problematic narrative that I believe still exists today about Tudor queens is the tendency to degrade and discredit them based on their supposed or potential sexual promiscuity. So I think Anne Boleyn is a perfect example of this. She was and still is sometimes referred to as things like the Great Whore or the concubine. And what's important to remember is that these were obviously real contemporary terms used to describe Anne by her enemies, by people like Eustace Chapuis, for example, who was the imperial ambassador in England at this time. He frequently used terms such as whore, concubine, she-devil to describe Anne. And this was for the simple purpose of insulting her and attacking her reputation, in Chapuis's case for political allegiance reasons as much as anything, I think. And obviously, I don't have an issue with people quoting contemporary sources such as these, but what I do have an issue with is sort of blindly believing them and taking them as facts today, just in order to discredit historical women or Tudor queens like Anne. And I think it's a kind of easy default attack to go to with women, this kind of attack on their moral reputation. I think it's incredibly outdated and reductive to remember women from history, based solely or largely on their supposed sexual exploits. And I think one of the most common perceptions of Anne today is still that she was, an adulteress or a seductress. A large reason behind that is obviously the trumped up charges against her that brought about her downfall. But the vast majority of historians today, including you and I think, would agree that Anne was not guilty of these charges brought against her. And yet this narrative of Anne as the great whore still persists in popular imagination. And this isn't to say, of course, that there are not amazing revisionist studies that exist today and that are coming out, that challenge these traditional narratives, and they're so important, but the preconception still exists. And I see people dismissing Anne, as a whore, or defining her solely as one of Henry's discarded wives, or remembering her only as an incestuous beheaded wife. I've seen it on social media, I see it in person, and I've heard these kinds of terms used to insult all sorts of historic women and other Tudor queens. And defining them solely by their sexual reputation or their moral reputation or their connection to their husbands or to other men in their life. It's used to diminish their influence, I think, and to strip back their agency and harm their reputation. And I think that's sort of scarily enough that reputation can seem as important today for women as it did 500 years ago sometimes. And I tend to find that if traditional narratives aren't sexualizing or discrediting historical women, then they romanticize them instead. So we also have this flip side of Anne, where we get the narratives, which I think are largely rooted in Victorian historiography, where she's the sort of romanticized tragic victim, the damsel in distress. And again, I think in its own way, this is too reductive. It also strips agency away. She wasn't just a victim. She wasn't just a scandalous wife. And I think what's important for our understanding today is to kind of strive for a bit of balance amongst these kind of extreme ends of the spectrum narratives that have been given to us, trying to find a middle ground amongst that. And I think another outdated narrative you come across a lot with regards to 16th century queens is comments on or analysis of their appearance and their marital status and not much else. And it's underpinned by a struggle we have with women throughout history, which is a lack of sources about their lives. That's the bottom line. And the sources that exist often, are about them in relation to their nearest male relative. But there are 16th century queens, for example, a couple off the top of my head, Anne of Cleves, Claude of France, who've somewhat been dismissed in years gone by, I think, for their supposedly unattractive or plain physical appearance. And this has made their lives and stories seem less appealing to tell. And I think absolutely that's changing now. And there are some incredible works out there and in the process at the moment. But it's a legacy of an outdated narrative that still persists, I think. This idea that women's histories aren't as interesting if the protagonist wasn't a real beauty. And I guess finally, one more that I would bring up is probably one of the most pervasive and outdated narratives that I see all the time, and I'm very keen to help overturn, is this tendency to pit women against one another. I've written a few articles on this myself recently, and it will be a theme of my work going forward. But we see this with Tudor queens, I think, specifically all the time. So we have, Catherine of Aragon versus Anne Boleyn versus Jane Seymour, Mary I versus Elizabeth I, Elizabeth I versus Mary Queen of Scots, so on and so forth. I think these queens obviously all had issues with one another. Their relationships were not without tension, but it doesn't mean that we cannot today appreciate, understand and admire all of these women as individuals without forcing them to compete against one another. And I think that's a theme we're going to be exploring today.
There was so much that I loved about what you just said. So much. I'm trying to remember now. What was I thinking as you were speaking? So I was also thinking that obviously Mary Boleyn has also suffered a lot from this exact same thing that you're talking about, this reputation that she somehow earned. And I actually have no idea where it's even come from. It's definitely not rooted in contemporary evidence. I was also thinking about Anne. It's interesting because we tend to read her story backwards like we do with all the Tudors. Obviously, you hear a lot of the time people saying, but she was at a very promiscuous court, so that's where she learned all these incredible, secrets that, You're right about the beauty as well. That was really interesting because I know myself, when I post any portrait that isn't incredibly attractive, people just don't want to believe it. They will fight you and they will say that cannot be Anne. Like Anne was beautiful, and you just think, goodness, she was so much more than obviously just her look. So it's so interesting, isn't it?
It's so interesting. And I think so much of it is because people like to kind of scandalize the stories or make them seem more dramatized than they actually were. And I think a lot of that, comes from the kind of just popular imagination of women today. And we kind of project that on the past, that they had to look a certain way. Contemporary standards of beauty were completely different 500 years ago to now. And the stories are just dramatic enough, I think, without this kind of need to over-sexualize them.
And just going back to Chapuis and other contemporaries using those phrases, obviously great whore and concubine and whatnot, it is exactly as you say, we do need to find the middle ground, don't we? Because there's clearly an agenda at work here and, we need to be aware of that when we are quoting those sources. So intriguing, fascinating. So why do you think, let's get to the nitty gritty. Why do you think there's this tendency to pit one woman against the other, whether she be royal or non-royal? Because we do see this a lot.
We really do. And I think there's a sort of fairly obvious kind of extensive systemic issue that kind of underpins all of these outdated narratives, and that is quite simply, I think, just sexism. I think the 16th century, was a patriarchal society. Our sources from this time largely come from men and from male points of view, and this is something that preceded the 16th century and has continued down throughout the centuries. And traditionally and generally speaking, obviously there are exceptions, but history has been written by men predominantly. I think even today, a lot of the famous historical works that you see cited were written by men, and some of them are absolutely wonderful. But I think that somehow women's voices throughout this tend to get a little bit lost. And it's so exciting for me today to see and be inspired by so many female scholars in this field at the moment. And obviously it's important to note that the tendency to pit one woman against one another is one that has been, and I'm sure will continue to be, also perpetuated by women. It's not just men who perpetuate that. But I do believe it's rooted in this kind of patriarchal idea that in order to build up one woman, you have to knock another down. So obviously there are so many modern day examples of this as well. An obvious one, I think, in the current British royal family is Meghan Markle and Kate Middleton, the Duchesses of Sussex and Cambridge, respectively. And whatever your personal feelings about these two women are, and I'm sure people have them, it's clear that I think the media and popular imagination do tend to pit them against one another. And I think there are other issues with this specific example at play. I think racism is also a factor as well as sexism. But what struck me most, I think, was actually when Meghan was pregnant with Archie, and the media headlines, would call her greedy for attention if she was touching her bump. But then those same media outlets would call Kate a really caring mother for touching her bump. And so you see these kind of really obvious discrepancies. And I think it plays into the kind of current social idea of having to be on a team, like to be Team Kate or Team Meghan, which could just as easily be applied to being Team Catherine or Team Anne from 500 years ago. And I think there's just still this kind of ingrained need in our society to praise one woman at the expense of another, which is something that desperately needs to change. We can get behind more than one woman at a time. We can admire and appreciate women as individuals without this kind of need for competition.
Yeah, that's so true. And I have to admit that I did have a Team Boleyn top, but I don't wear it anymore, Kate.
No, and it's
I
great.
feel terrible now. I'm like, I don't know my Team Boleyn top anymore. No. However, I am Team Boleyn, but I'm also Team everybody else, so that's fine.
That's the thing, isn't it? We can be teams, but let's not exclude other teams.
Exactly. No, I totally agree with you. And what I always find a little bit shocking, and this could be because I have predominantly female followers on social media. So I just want to say that first. However, anytime that I've seen these sorts of comments, they have come from women, which I find really disturbing. As you said, of course, this is rooted in patriarchy and whatnot, but it seems that today, my experience is I've found it is usually women that attack other women.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see that a lot as well. I think it again seems to be something that's just kind of in our psyche as a society, that we have to big someone up by bringing someone down. And, I also don't think it's exclusive to women. I think it happens to men as well, definitely, this kind of competitiveness and need to kind of choose one over another. But yeah, it does seem to be perpetuated by women a lot on social media. I would say that I found that as well. And I think, it's kind of a cliqueiness that I think we need to sort out, because it's not, it is outdated. I really do believe it's outdated. I believe that we've expanded enough now in terms of our horizons and our values now, that we can be broad-minded and open-minded enough to appreciate women as individuals and not have to have an element of competition brought in.
Definitely. And this sort of belief, that you can't admire both, for example, I'm just picking these two women as examples, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn is one that I'm sure you've seen. I've seen it said so many times, even directed at me, because of course, predominantly I work on Anne Boleyn. So people kind of assume, oh, you must not like Catherine, but quite to the contrary, I think Catherine's just amazing. So what do you think about that whole thing where you can't like Anne and Catherine, or you can't like Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots?
I just think, I think it's a real assumption that people make, because obviously I'm the same, obviously working largely on Anne Boleyn and working at Anne's childhood home. We have a lot of people who assume, and I know Owen, obviously Dr. Owen Emerson, he's the same working at Hever too, that we are Boleyn fans over anything else. And obviously we are Boleyn fans. I adore Anne, but it doesn't mean I also think that Catherine of Aragon was like an incredible, intelligent, educated, strong, powerful woman. And I can still appreciate that. I can love Anne and her story and find her fascinating, but I can still find fascination in Catherine. I think those two are a great example. For centuries, I think they've been pitted against one another, with historical narratives kind of delighting in their feigned rivalry and their differences. They were adversaries in love and in power and in religion in their lifetime. they shared a husband, but maybe very little else. That's the kind of traditional history we've been told. It's painted Catherine as the kind of scorned Catholic wife, and then Anne is this bewitching reformist seductress. And I don't think that's ever been a fair portrayal of either queen. I think it's way too simplified, and it only succeeds really by tapping into this kind of outdated social dynamic, which is the praising one woman only to the detriment of the other. And this kind of confused rush to feel like you have to only be for one woman and against the other. It only increases the division between them. And of course, these queens have many crucial differences. We can't erase those, and we wouldn't want to, but we should also widen our perspectives to consider that they also shared a lot in common. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, sparked by something I came across in my research. But just, on the offset, these women they shared humanist international educations. They shared intelligence and bookishness, piety and religious engagement, even if they were at slightly different ends of the religious spectrum. These two women were both very pious. They were both at the whims of their very mercurial husband, and they both ultimately failed in their queenly duty, to provide a male heir. But they had daughters whose legacies ironically outshone that of Henry's sole longed for son. So there are kind of synergies between these two queens that I think maybe haven't been considered because they've been lost in this rush to declare them only as rivals. And it's something that I think we need to look at a bit more closely.
It does reduce them, doesn't it, to some sort of two-dimensional cutout. And I think that possibly comes from the fact that because we've heard so much about them, we read so much about them, we watch them on television shows and movies, they've almost transformed into characters rather than human beings. But of course, we're all complicated, aren't we, humans? Complex, layered. And I just think, it just doesn't do them service, does it, when we reduce them to those labels? And
we have to look at all those different facets, because like you said, otherwise they're just two-dimensional.
And you mentioned some things that you uncovered in your amazing research. So tell us a little bit about the insights you were able to glean from the work you did about their relationship, their connection. And I am still here talking about Catherine of Aragon and Boleyn.
Yes, so during my work with Anne's printed book of hours, which we hold at Hever, I discovered that Anne was not the only Tudor queen to own a copy of this same printing, and actually Catherine, Anne's great rival, also owned a copy. And the two of them may very well have actually read their same books together in a shared group of prayer. And this is absolutely a new kind of connection between these two women, and is definite proof that they had more in common than we might have thought. And I think it's this kind of initial connection that sparked me to think a little bit more about what they may have shared. And it's a connection that comes at a very pivotal point in the English court. It's between sort of 1527, 1528. When these books were produced. And obviously that's when Anne's star is very much on the rise. We think by this point, Henry's proposed and she's accepted. And Catherine's star is, subsequently on the wane. So it's a huge kind of time of change in the structure of the Henrician court. And that's why it's an extra intriguing connection, I think, between these two women at this time. But their shared book, it also reflects their famed differences. There's levels of decoration across both copies, which are revealingly different. Anne's copy is illuminated to a significantly greater extent than to Catherine's. Anne's book has these full-length gold borders adorning pages. She has extra images and red and blue elliptical frames and corner decoration. Catherine's copy does not have any of that extra decoration. And of course, that could simply be representative of Anne's personal, choices and enjoyment in opulent objects, but also it could be an insight, I think, into something more suggestive, which is her personal ambition at the time. But either way, we have a kind of clear example, I think, of how we can appreciate the differences between these two queens, but also widen our understanding to see their similarities, because like their respective books, they were the same but different. So we have that kind of really nice example.
Yeah, I like that you've brought up the piety, because this is something that always kind of mind boggles me, that we're very happy to accept the sincerity of Catherine of Aragon's piety, but when it comes to Anne, why is it that people feel that she simply adopted a posture of, being a pious woman or a reformed posture in order to gain some political power? Whereas with Catherine, we don't question it, we just believe that she was a pious woman. But with Anne, there seems to people want to think that there was this ulterior motive rather than that she was a genuinely pious woman and genuinely interested in reform.
I think, again, it comes back to the kind of traditional narrative of Catherine as the Catholic wife, the good Catholic wife, and Anne as the kind of reformist harlot. I think a lot of it's probably rooted as well in kind of Catholic propaganda at the time, those kind of ideas of them as being so different. But yeah, I think that actually Anne was an incredibly pious woman. We have a lot of evidence to suggest that she was. Piety doesn't mean, engagement with the Catholic faith necessarily, although obviously these books of ours are Catholic texts, so we do see her still engaging with that kind of literature. But we have so many records of books that she owned that were, heavily religious in nature, particularly later in the 1520s and into her reign as queen. We have books that show, including the one that's prefaced with George Boleyn's wonderful introduction and dedication to her by Jacques Lefebvre de Table. But we have all sorts of evidence to show that she was really engaging with and importing, religious books, particularly ones from France. We know that she read the Bible in French. She encouraged her women, her ladies, to also read the Bible in French. They would have read together, read the Bible, read scriptures. And, she also seems to have conducted a very pious household, probably having learnt from Catherine's example, having been a member of Catherine's household and seen how her ladies were told to conduct themselves. So I think actually Anne would have learnt a lot from Catherine and from Catherine's example, which again is something we don't often think of her doing. We see them as so separate, but they absolutely were both engaged, very actively engaged with religion and religious thought and religious literature, even if it was sort of maybe different ends of the spectrum.
Yes, and until her last days, wasn't she, when she had books coming in while she was imprisoned in the Tower. So, it's really fascinating. I know that also, so going back to your research again, you talked quite a bit last time we chatted about this subject, about female networks, and I found this so fascinating. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, yeah, absolutely. So that was another kind of key aspect of my research, I guess, was being able to kind of piece together the path that Anne's printed book of hours took in the years after her ownership, which we just didn't know about before. So I found 4 new inscriptions within the book, which really helped me to kind of see who the later owners were and string them together in this network that you mentioned. And it became really clear that the book continued its 16th century life after Anne within the predominantly female hands of a provincial gentry family in Kent, situated around Hever, who protected the memory of Anne, of its original owner, by ensuring the survival of her signed inscription. And I think something we cannot forget with this is that that's a particularly brave act. In the wake of Anne's dramatic downfall, we know that Henry pretty much attempted a sort of systematic erasure of Anne from history as he quickly moved on to his third wife, Jane. And so not much is known, I think, about Anne's immediate afterlife and her immediate memory. And so this is a really nice example. And it's a real story of female solidarity, I think, and community and bravery by the women who kept Anne's book safe. And I think alongside that kind of community who formed to protect Anne's legacy is a community that develops as a result of being inspired by Anne's note in the book. I think it's become a real encouraging safe space for rare female expression. The presence of Anne's note seems to have inspired these women who owned the book after her to also add their own notes and messages and kind of continue to personalize the book in this very intimate way. And so I think now it's really become this kind of communal symbol for a gendered identity, really. And it's also significant that those who owned the book after Anne's downfall seem also to have been very much law-abiding Kent families, because we can see that they've erased the feasts of St. Thomas Becket, for example, and the names of the popes, which became law in 1537. But that in itself, I think, is a great subversive paradox, because they're obeying the law and obeying the king, but they're also harbouring this kind of fugitive signature in the book. And I think that makes it particularly special. And I also think we don't often appreciate Anne's female kind of friendships or her female network. We don't necessarily look into them. There's not a huge amount of information about them. So this is I think a really beautiful example of how a group of women who personally knew Anne, treasured her memory despite her big disgrace and her execution.
Yeah, it is beautiful. And when I read it, I was so happy because obviously, as you know, Kate, she was robbed of her sister in the last couple of years. She was robbed of her sister-in-law. So I hope that she had, good friends there to help her through that period. Because really, from the start of 1535, she was well aware that every single person was watching her. She was already feeling quite stressed and under pressure. So that's a long time that she had to have without her, some of her close female relatives. So I hope that those women were able to somehow give her some support during that period. So, Kate, we've talked about the fact that these outdated narratives, they've been absorbed into our popular consciousness. So what do we do? How do we go about changing it?
I think, well, to be honest, I think we're absolutely in the process of changing, some of these outdated views. And I think the main thing is to do what we're doing right now, which is to talk about them. I think lots of people wouldn't necessarily even think about these problematic narratives or outdated views because it doesn't necessarily occur to you and that they even exist unless you're sort of sensitive to them or looking for them. And so firstly, I think identifying that there are narratives that maybe need to be revised or changed, that's a great first step. And then eventually it's about rewriting those old narratives. It's about applying the revisionist thought to these kind of traditional narratives and challenging what we know. And there are amazing revisionist works coming out all the time. A couple I know about that I can't yet say anything about. And there are also fabulous ones like our friend, wonderful friend and scholar, Dr. Estelle Parank's new book, Blood, Fire and Gold, which is about Elizabeth I and Catherine de' Medici, who are seen as traditional rivals. And she really explores that a bit more. And of course, your own incredible book, which is coming out later this year, which I had the privilege of reading it already. So I can say that it is incredible. And that does literally challenge everything we know about the last year of Anne's life. And I think those kind of works are key. We have to challenge what we've been told by histories written 30, 40, 50 plus years ago, and not be afraid to rethink, and to relook at sources and bring a new pair of eyes or a new perspective to them. And to be aware that these kind of pervasive narratives are probably stamped across quite a lot of what has already been written. So we have to sort of try and strip that back a bit and undo some of that work in order to redo the histories with a more open, challenging, curious mind.
And it's not an easy process. I can say that from experience. It's quite a daunting process. It's a time-consuming process. And it does take a lot of energy. The other thing I found is sometimes it's challenging to question what somebody has been saying for a long time, especially when that somebody is someone like Professor Eric Ives, the late Professor Eric Ives. You think to yourself, well, who am I to challenge what he said? But in fact, that's what each and every one of us has to do. And I spent, as you know, a long time just checking everything, double checking, triple checking things. Yes. And I was shocked. I was actually shocked at how many times I came across stories that I thought I knew so well, and they were in fact fiction or somebody's interpretation, or they were from, 100 years after Anne had died or something like that. So you're right. It is so important for us to, set aside the imposter syndrome and just go in there and think about these things, talk about them. We're allowed to have interpretations, aren't we?
We are. And you're so right. It's unreal how much we sort of just take as fact without actually kind of checking. And when you do put in the work to kind of check even the most amazing, biographies like Professor Eric Ives, there are always little bits that you think, actually, that's not quite correct. And maybe I can bring a new perspective to that. And your book is doing that tenfold. So it's very exciting.
Oh, thank you so much. And just keeping an open mind, right? Like it's hard sometimes, isn't it, to admit, oh, I did get that wrong, or that, there's been new research. I need to rethink that. It's not easy to do that when you've had a certain story going around in your head for 20 years to then, I was just chatting with Dr. Owen Emerson, and we're always talking about Anne's birth date, which drives us both bonkers. And, there's new information coming out that possibly it was a little bit later. I'm willing to, to accept that. But we were just having a laugh, thinking how hard it is to say, oh, okay, this what I've had in my head for all this time maybe isn't correct.
Exactly. It's like deep beliefs and maybe even things that we've written about or spoken about. And you have to always be open to the possibility that things might change, because history is evolving in that way, which is so exciting. I think it's a really exciting time in this area and in this kind of era as well, because there is a lot right now that's being challenged and being revised. So it's always about just staying tuned to see what someone new is bringing is bringing.
Exactly. No, I totally agree with you. So in terms of just writing about women in general, what do you think are some of, and you've already mentioned a couple, what do you think are some of the challenges associated with writing about women from the past?
Oh, I think there are many. And I think this has probably played into some of the kind of traditional narratives that we have seen. I think, like I briefly mentioned, first and foremost is probably the huge lack of source material that can be available to scholars to go about writing about women. You know, like I said earlier, women were largely not seen as worthy of note necessarily, apart from in relation to their nearest male kin. You know, whether that was related to their father or their husband or their sons, that's generally how we see women kind of referred to or recorded. They weren't often recorded as individuals. And I think a lack of educational opportunity also contributes hugely to our lack of source material about women. In comparison to men, we have less female writings still available to us today. And what we do have tends to be from obviously women of the kind of aristocracy or royalty, as opposed to women of lower social classes whose voices are even harder to, I think, track down. But I think we also have to be aware when writing about women from the past that we don't force modern morals onto history. You know, I've obviously spoken quite a lot about how it is important to use our modern awareness of issues and how this has affected the history of writing in the past. But equally, we can't start claiming, for example, which I do see sometimes, that, you know, Anne Boleyn was the first feminist. You know, these are kinds of terms that just did not exist 500 years ago, and we can't force that onto the past. We can't avoid the outdated narratives by going to the other extreme. So again, it's about trying to find that kind of balance, I think, which can be really hard because we obviously all bring our own experiences and views and values to what we write. As much as we try, I think it's impossible to be completely impartial. And it's a very nuanced topic. You know, we have to be aware that we have to revise these outdated narratives with our modern perspectives, but without projecting or forcing them onto the past. You know, I think that's a good place to start, but it is a challenge, definitely.
I try hard to look for, if I'm thinking about a person, you know, to find the contemporary evidence as in what did other people around them think about them at that time or say about them, rather than me just diagnosing people with, you know, things. And Henry is a good example, isn't he? It's so tempting. And I know I've said it myself before and thought it myself. It's so tempting to diagnose him with a personality disorder. You know, to me, it's clear that if he was here, that's probably what he would be diagnosed with. But does that help us understand him if we put those modern labels on him? I'm not sure. So I think it's better to look, for example, you know, there's some great quotes of Eustace Chapuis describing Henry that are just perfect. And I think that's more useful, isn't it? Rather than me saying, oh, I think he may have had this or that. You know, Chapuis saying that he thinks Henry, you know, only thought about Henry is much more powerful.
Absolutely. I mean, Chapuis had a way with words, didn't he? His sort of his quotes are amazing, but it's exactly that. I think it's, you know, still listening to the contemporary voices and contemporary sources, but just challenging what we think we know about them, you know, using the kind of wider minds we have today, but we can't just project that back onto the past. It's a really tricky balance.
What a fun and exciting career path we've chosen, Kate.
Yes, isn't it?
So you've got so much going on. Tell us a little bit about where, you know, listeners can go to find out about your work.
Oh, there's a lot in the works at the moment, actually, which is really exciting. You can follow me on my Twitter page, is probably where I'm most active, which is Kate McCaffrey, and also my recent Instagram page, which Owen actually forced me to set up about a month ago, which is Kate McCaffrey Historian. And I also have a website, katemccaffrey.wordpress.com, but is something that I need to update more often, I'll be honest. And you can also keep tabs on Hever Castle socials, you know, the events and books and things that we have coming up over the next couple of years at Hever, particularly next year, which is something that we're working on at the moment, exhibition-wise, which is very relevant to the things we've talked about today. And there's a book that we are currently writing, which will be going alongside that, and I'm writing that with Owen and also with our head curator Alison Palmer this time, which is very exciting. So there's lots of things in the works, personally as well as to do with Hever. So definitely keep tabs on my socials and Hever's socials, and come and see our exhibition as well if you're interested and if you are local. Yeah, lots of exciting things.
That's so fantastic. I'm so excited. And you know, Kate, I will be there. I'll be staying at Hever Castle 2 nights at the end of September. I'm just going to be, you're just going to see me bouncing around
Honestly, we are ready to roll the red carpet out because I can't believe I've not met you in person yet. So it'll be so exciting to finally
I
meet you.
can't wait. So there is a lot to look forward to. And I know I've had some hints about some good things next year,
Yes.
so I may need to make another return trip. Kate, thank you so much. As always, it's been such a pleasure speaking with you. And thank you so much for taking part in all things 16th century women.
Thank you so much. It's a wonderful event.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Talking Tudors. Thank you so much for joining us. I absolutely love to hear from listeners, so if you have any comments or suggestions, or just want to say hi, please get in touch with me via my website, www.onthetudortrail.com, where you'll also find show notes for today's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, please share the podcast with friends and family, and don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. I also invite you to join our Talking Tudors podcast group on Facebook, where you can interact with other Tudor history lovers and hear all the behind-the-scenes news. You'll also find me on Twitter. My handle is On The Tudor Trail, and on Instagram as The Most Happy 78. It's time now for us to re-enter the modern world. As always, I look forward to talking Tudors with you again very soon.